One of the ways I think about open source projects is it solves a problem. And then there's a different aspect of the productization of that solution, the usage aspect of it, the buying aspect of it, but also the consumption aspect of it. I don't want to host it, for example, and I just want it to be completely operated and managed by somebody else. And that's a whole productized version of it. How do you think about the separation between open source and the commercial product that comes out of it?
Well, I think, the words that you're using there, and I think they're so close that they sometimes confuse us, is project and product.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes when folks get really enmeshed in this world, they start to confuse these things and they view the open source project as the product in and of itself. Now, I think this is exacerbated because we're seeing open source projects become more product like. For instance, Joyent started the Node, ecosystem, and but the reality is that you can go and download Node and you get documentation, you get an install experience. It feels very much like a product, and I think that's part of sort of modern open source where these lines are starting to blur. But at the end of the day, it's still just a project, right? It's not, a product in my mind is something that has a SKU, and you pay money and for goods and services, right? Like that is a product. And a project really is, there's still a certain amount of like, you're on your own here, take it or leave it type of thing.
Yep.
And so I think, part of this is a product is the value that you're adding on top of the project so that you can bring and charge money for it. And there's different things that you can actually, and I think it's worth talking about what are the size of the moats that you bring as you start adding that value. And I think the easiest thing to think about is some support and documentation and trusted builds and that type of thing. And I think it's very easy to say, well, we'll take this open source project, we'll provide support, we'll have a 24/7 on call if you hit problems, we'll provide extended documentations, and we'll all wrap it up in a bow for you. And I think that's the traditional distribution model. And I think this comes from sort of the Linux distribution world, where a Linux distribution, I had a former Red Hat employee that worked for us call it, walking over broken glass as a service, right? Because the traditional open source is you take all these different projects that maybe some of them have versions, maybe some of them, have bugs, and they all are built in different ways. And you're bringing all this stuff together, doing some cross integration tests, and say like, here's a set of things based on open source that we've brought together, can work together, and we're going to support it. And so that's the traditional sort of open source support model. And there's a lot of value to be added there. And, but one of the problems there is that the crappier the open source projects are in terms of user experience, the more value you're bringing. As we look at these more modern projects, right, like it's very hard to build a distribution over something like Node because the project is so darn good that the level of value there. And so in that world, what we see is we see companies like Snyk start to come up, where now what they're doing is they're helping you to, hey, you're just not using Node, you're using the Node ecosystem. The Node ecosystem is big and hairy. How can we actually provide a level of intelligence and thoughtfulness around making sure that as you bring that stuff together, you're bringing it together in a responsible way? So they're starting to fill in some of those gaps around security and compatibility and sort of hygiene that you often would used to buy through the distribution, the Linux distros. Next level of value is that there's features that you can get when you buy the product, and those features aren't available when you're talking about the project. And I think that's where we get into sort of like what we were calling previously the difference between like open core, where only one company can deliver those enterprise features, whereas I think open extensibility, there's a level playing field for multiple folks, open source projects or commercial companies adding those value added features. And then finally, I think the last level is the hosting experience around this open source, where especially when we're moving into the cloud world, distributed systems, software is not a static thing, right? I think old open source is like libpng. I can decode PNGs without having to write my own decoder, right? Modern open source is Cassandra or Kubernetes or what have you. These things take a certain level of complexity, a certain level of skill and dedication. They're living, breathing things that somebody needs to be on the hook for. I think anybody who's ever administered a database knows this, right? Like,
Yep.
Like you don't just launch a database and be like, okay, it's good, done, step away, right? No, you need a DBA, you need somebody doing backups and testing those backups. That's real value that's being layered on top of this. And so that's another place that you can create a product out of the project. And so I think we're seeing different companies look across these different ways of monetizing and really constructing both the open source to allow for this stuff, but also playing around with the different models for how they can start adding value and turn product from project.
Yeah, your analogy of the burger with the experience, I think, is so apt here, where it's the experience that I buy, and there's a central IP there that, of course, stands at the core of it. But that's not what I'm looking for. As a buyer, I'm looking for the whole experience, and whether it's a cocktail, and whether you need a cocktail or a great ambience to go with it, that's maybe success
And
of
maybe
level.
we can mix in some of the meal prep services into
That's
the
right.
analogy there also, right? Because like that's kind of open source is like, there's a certain level of open source product, which
Yeah,
is the meal prep, where it's like,
yeah.
hey, you're still doing it all yourself, but we're going to give you the directions and the support, and we're going to give you all the things already neatly cut and prepared, and it's going to be beautiful.